speaking of President Bush, you were with him on one of our nation's worst days, 9/11. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
It's stuck in my head as if it was yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
If I was going to summarize it, Sandra, I'd say that it was a mixture of the intensity of doing my job with the surreal. So, an example of the intensity. When we left Sarasota, we were flying around the Gulf of Mexico, not sure where we were going to head on Air Force One. And the president asked to see me. So in his compartment, in his office on Air Force One, it was his chief of staff, Andy Card, the president, and me. And the president looked me in the eye and he said, "Michael, who did this?" And it's kind of a direct question you got from George Bush, kind of direct question you get from a president. And I told him that I hadn't seen any intelligence yet that would take us to a perpetrator. But I told him that I was supremely confident that when we got to the end of the trail, we would find Al Qaeda and bin Laden. And I told him I was so confident in that I would bet my children's future on it.
Wow.
I've never told them that, by the way. And then he looked at me and he said, "When will we know?" Right. And that's a kind of a question that doesn't actually have an answer, right? So you fall back on what analysts do, which is to provide context. So I told him about 3 or 4 times when America had been attacked before by terrorists and how long it took us to find out. And that allowed me to bound it, right, for him. In some cases, it was 2 days until we found out who did it. And in some cases, it was a year. The Khobar Towers bombing in Saudi Arabia took us a year to figure out that was the Iranians. And so I was able to bind it for him, right, by saying, "Mr. President, we may know soon, or it may take some time." Another example of the intensity was on the flight back to Andrews Air Force Base that night. George Tenet sent me a piece of intelligence that a European intelligence service had shared with us. And here's the president who had just suffered the worst attack on the homeland in the history of the country. And his intelligence briefer is showing him a piece of information, don't have any understanding of its credibility or where it came from, besides the European service that gave it to us. And it said that what happened that morning was the first of 2 waves of attacks that would happen on the United States. And then an example of the surreal, as we were landing, there were many moments during the day like this. As we were landing that night at Andrews, the president's military aide, who carries the nuclear football, he and I had become friends the previous 9 months, and he was looking out the windows on the left side of the aircraft as we were on final approach, and it was dark in the cabin, and so I went over and I looked out, and there was an F-16 on the wingtip, and he said, "Michael, that's an F-16, DC Air National Guard." And that plane was so close that you could see the pilot, you could see the pilot's facial features, you could see the pilot looking at us, and in the distance, you could see the still smoldering Pentagon.
Wow.
And then the military aide said something to me, which to this very day sends shivers up my spine. He said, "Michael, do you know why they're there?" Right? And I had no idea why they were there. At that point, every civilian airliner, had been grounded. Mm-hmm. Only military planes were in the air. He said, "Michael, their job is if someone fires a surface-to-air missile at us on final approach, their job is to put themselves between that missile and the President of the United States."